It has just gone 8 o'clock. Welcome to the Thursday edition of Face the Nation. My name is Oliver Dixon, standing in tonight for Clement Manyatela. Coming up on the show, well, the Tourism Portfolio Committee had met with the Tourism Minister, Patricia de Lille. She had to answer a lot of questions about the dissolving of the board, following, of course, a series of controversial decisions. We're going to be speaking to the chairperson of the Tourism Portfolio Committee tonight on the show. The B20 Sherpa has handed over to the Minister of International Relations and the President of the country 30 recommendations for the G20 heads of state to consider for business development, particularly for the financing of infrastructure-based projects in G20 developing member states. We're going to be diving into the detail of those 30 recommendations. And then in 2022, President Cyril Ramaphosa put together an anti-corruption advisory panel, which was meant to advise him and the rest of the state on how to tackle corruption, but more importantly, improve the country's corruption perception index. It's 3 years later. Have they done anything substantive to move the needle? We'll find out tonight. But first, my comment. And welcome. So yesterday, the Deputy National Police Commissioner, Lieutenant Shedrick Sibia, appeared in the Gauteng High Court, challenging National Police Commissioner General Fani Masimula's decision to issue him with a stay-at-home order following allegations made against Sibia by KZN Provincial Police Commissioner General Mkwanazi. Here's a reminder of the specific allegations made by Mkwanazi against Sibia.
On the 26th of March 2025, this year, a total of 121 case dockets that were under investigation were taken away from the task team as directed by a Deputy National Commissioner Crime Detection, a Lieutenant General Sibia, who was acting on the instruction of the Minister of Police to disband the team. This was done without the authority of the National Commissioner, nor I, as a Provincial Commissioner, was never informed.
It was an explosive day, but Masimula issued Sibia with a stay-at-home order after President Ramaphosa placed Minister Senzo Mchunu on special leave of absence and instituted the Madlanga Commission to look into political meddling in the criminal justice system. In court yesterday, Sibia's legal counsel, Advocate Camille Premet, argued that Masimula acted ultra vires, that is to say, beyond the scope of his powers when he placed Sibia on precautionary suspension. In substantiating this argument, Sibia's team argued that Masimula is conflicted because he is an interested party in the various allegations that are underway. Have a look at this.
General Masimula himself is heavily intertwined in the factual matrix that gives rise to the basis for the suspension of General Sibia. And considering that General Masimula sits in the superior position in that suspension decision as against General Sibia, the point to be made, and this is why we ask for the interdictory, alternatively suspensive relief, is that a conflicted party can't sit as the judge in their own cause. Because remember, what General Masimula is testing is whether or not General Sibia's conduct complied with his instructions based on what he decided. But he's also the body who makes the decision to suspend. And we say that's the conflict which demonstrates why General Masimula's processes are inappropriate.
So, because Mkwanazi never made any specific allegations against Masimula specifically, Masimula was sort of thought of as an innocuous and neutral actor in all of this. But now that the dust has settled from the rancorous anxiety of demanding action to be taken, I want to invite you into thinking a little deeper about this. Has National Police Commissioner Fani Masimula acted in the best interest of the criminal justice system when he was faced with difficult decisions? And if not, what should happen? I want you to consider this. When Minister Mchunu improperly issued an instruction for the KZN Political Killings Task Team to be disbanded and for the related 121 case dockets to be moved from KZN to Pretoria, Masimula was on a December holiday, and Masimula seemingly did not attempt to correct this until there was public pressure to do so. When Masimula returned the documents to Mkwanazi's team last week, he did so months after the fact. Now that the dockets have been returned, we know that they should never have left KZN to begin with. Either Masimula had no idea that Mkunu's instructions were incorrect, which means he doesn't have a full appreciation for the statutory environment he operates in, or he knew that the dockets needed to be returned, but he chose to do nothing about it, akin to dereliction of duty. Because if he did know, surely he would have had a duty to return the dockets as soon as possible. And what he became aware of this, he didn't immediately act. Either way, this begs the question, did General Masimula act in the best interest of the criminal justice system? I think it's reasonable for Sibia to not be on duty while investigations are underway into this whole saga. As Masimula stated in court, I think correctly so, this could contaminate the investigation, which is a generally accepted principle when investigations into conduct of office bearers are conducted. But insofar as he's correct that Masimula is a conflicted actor in all of this, what should Masimula do? What is your take on the arguments made in the case Sibia brought against Masimula in court yesterday? You can send us your WhatsApp voice notes right now on 078-459-1897. I'll repeat that, 078-459-1897. Remember to tell us your name and surname and where you're sending the voice note from, and keep it to under 30 seconds. Or you can find us on X at Face the Nation SABC. And welcome back. The B20, representing businesses from the G20 countries, has handed over recommendations to the G20 Presidency, contributing to the G20 summit in November later this year. B20 Sherpa Cascovaria says if implemented, the 30-point recommendations can be transformative. He says the implementation of the proposals are critical and that in the next 2 months, ahead of the G20 Leaders Summit, the B20 will be lobbying for the acceptance and implementation of the recommendations. Chairperson of the B20 Trade and Investment Task Force, Busi Mabuza, joins us now for more. Busi, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. These 30 recommendations span across 8 or 9 key themes. Walk us through what those themes are and what some of the key recommendations are there.
So there are indeed 8 task forces, Oliver, and as indicated, I chair the Trade and Investment Task Force. So if I may just focus on the work that the Trade and Investment Task Force has done since February this year. Our focus has, of course, been on the trade and investment environment, and we are calling on the G20 nations to promote stability in global trade. And this is an emphasis on the work that was done by our colleagues in Brazil last year, where they called for the stabilization of the trade and investment governance framework. Secondly, we are calling for a new trade and investment deal for Africa with the G20 nations. And I believe that this hangs beautifully on the work that was done by our Indian counterparts in 2023, where they called for the integration of Africa into the global economy and therefore moved for the inclusion of the African Union as a G20 member. Finally, we recognized, of course, that business and trade has to be responsive to the climate change events that we continue to see. But this responsiveness has to consider that developing nations did not contribute as much to the crisis that we're seeing at the moment, and therefore it has to be done in a manner that is orderly, interoperable, and that leaves nobody behind.
Busi, you have one of the most controvertible task forces in the 8 task forces that exist across the B20. Trade and investment has become the center of controversy, of course, given that one of the largest member states of the G20, the USA, had, of course, imposed on just about every other country in the world what many call punitive trade barriers, such as, of course, high tariffs. To what extent do the recommendations, the 30 recommendations, address that, and very specifically the work of the task force you were heading up?
very, very directly. And I'm pleased to say, Oliver, that in the room, we had 41 nations represented, including the United States of America. So when we talk about the US imposing tariffs, it is, of course, an administration. Our counterparts in business recognize that business needs a stable, predictable environment in order to plan, in order to make investment decisions, in order to execute and reap the reward. And so our call for the promotion of a stable global trade environment, our call for the rollback of the current tariffs that we've seen coming to the fore has been supported by everybody that has been in the room as we engaged.
So one of the issues with regards to global trade is that developing nations like South Africa and most of Africa, which of course is represented in the G20 through the African Union, suffer from, generally speaking, a trade deficit. That is to say, they import more than they export. That means in real terms, developing economies aren't growing. They're at the behest of global economic giants like China, like India to a very large extent, if you look at service exports, but more specifically like the US. Of course, incorrectly, Donald Trump has claimed that the trade deficit seems to be against the US. And of course, that would mean that we would have to have a trade surplus. But that's not necessarily the net outcome of the case. How do the recommendations address very specifically the trade deficit that developing nations often face?
So two things that are addressed, and I'll start with the trade deficit. We're still, the African continent mostly exports raw commodities, and we import beneficiated goods at a much higher cost and value, which is why we keep being on the wrong side of the trade equation, and which is the reason why the African continent has actually used every measure available to us to ensure that trading partners such as the United States, an important trading partners such as European countries, remain on our side, remain available because they take more of the beneficiated goods from us. Now, the new trade and investment deal for the African continent actually calls specifically for further investment into the continent, investment into infrastructure, investment into manufacturing, closer to source, and all of these measures will help the African continent close the gap insofar as
just very quickly on that, Busi, the G20 is not the first multilateral body or trade organization or institution in the world to highlight that, to problematize that disparity, but also to say, well, these things need to be beneficiated at source. That is to say, African nation states in particular must be able to develop industries and economies around the commodities that they have. I think this is trite and has been the case for a very long time. What's been lacking is political will, for the most part, in having the ball roll on this. The World Trade Organization has said this before, the World Bank has said this before, and all other Bretton Woods institutions. What's different this time around political will that you think South Africa's presidency can activate and initiate?
Well, that people don't hear you doesn't mean you stop talking. We are talking when we're at the table with the G20 nations. We're talking to over 80% of global GDP, over 75% of global trade, and over 60% of the world's population. And we have seen, in terms of our engagements in the dialogues, in the meetings that we've held from February to date, we've seen a keen interest from our counterparts in the G20 nations to solution for the African continent. And we are saying that promoting a stable trade and investment environment is one way of achieving that. A new trade and investment deal for the African continent is another way of doing that. And we believe that we have, in fact, even put specific measures that are going to help us track whether we are performing in that regard or not.
Interestingly, the argument made by orthodox economists is that Africa doesn't need more investment, particularly not more investment from the West. What Africa needs is to be freed from the shackles of throttling debt. Many African nation states are highly indebted, and that is why many African nation states don't have capital expenditure on growth, but rather expenditure on repaying debt and the high interest on the debt. Many argue, orthodox economists that is, if that Africa is to have their debt restructured, particularly the debt owed to Bretton Woods institutions and the West, that Africa will have enough capital to invest in itself and not necessarily need the capital of the West. How is the investment conversation framed in those recommendations?
Well, that is most certainly not the only variable that's important, but it is an important variable. And the fact that we pay a perception premium in terms of the debt that we raise outside of our own currencies is an important factor as well. So our debt is much more expensive because of the perception premium. And if we are able to address that, Oliver, I believe that we will begin seeing improved debt to GDP equations. Forgiving debt, we've seen that restructuring of debt will address very little if we continue to have the punitive interest rates that we have seen. Secondly, we also need to learn to live within the means that we have, which is why it's so important that countries such as South Africa have very strong fiscal and monetary measures that keep watch on what it is, whether we're living within our means or not. I'm not saying we're living within our means at the moment, but I believe that if our economy ticked up, we would be able to get the benefit of the reduction of the ratio of our debt to our GDP, and therefore we would have a much better experience. So the issue of debt is an issue. It's not the only issue. We also need to manufacture more. We need to add value more. We need to invest in our infrastructure so that it doesn't cost as much to get goods from the factory floor to the port. And we also need to ensure that our own customs regimes and the fact that we've signed on to the African Continental Free Trade Area, we actually put regulation in place that will accelerate the implementation of this AfCFTA so that we can see our intra-Africa trade tick up from the current levels, which are in the mid-teens, to the 50s or 60s that you see in other regions.
Part of the global disparity and power imbalance of trade and investment is that oftentimes recommendations made by multilateral bodies like the World Trade Organization and the G20 often are adopted by developing nations because they believe in the promise that these reforms hold, right? Not just in debt when we look at structural reform programs, but also in the declarations of multilateral bodies. For instance, the World Trade Organization has for a very long time advocated for countries to open their trade borders to stimulate more global trade. But what that has resulted in is that one side of the equation adheres to it, developing nations, and the other side doesn't seemingly have to adhere to it, developed nations. And global trade and investment can only be fixed when there's an adherence to the recommendations and the declarations by all member states. Accountability, therefore, is an important exercise. Talk to us about what the B20's imagination around accountability to declarations and investments, trade and investments looks like. Kesko Vadia says we must lobby. What's more than that?
And I'll focus on the calls that the Trade and Investment Task Force have made, which are specific to the functioning of the World Trade Organization. Business definitely, and our task force certainly supports our government's calls for multilateral, working, inclusive, sustainable, multilateral frameworks. And in that respect, we as the Trade and Investment Task Force have said that the World Trade Trade Organization is a very important structure for world trade, for world economies, for supply chains, for workable and inclusive global trade. And we've therefore called on our G20 leadership to step up and ensure that reforms are accelerated at the WTO. We need a functional WTO, and we need a WTO that is supported by our respective nations. And there are low-hanging fruit there, such as the dispute resolution mechanisms that could be resolved, I think, at the blink of an eye if our governments committed to it.
Yeah, and just lastly, in what spirit were these recommendations received by the Presidency and the Minister of International Relations?
So they were presented today by the B20 to the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation. I expect that the officials are now going to actually go through the recommendations and see what they can do with them. In fact, in our case as the Trade and Investment Task Force, we had the benefit, Oliver, of interacting with the G20 Trade and Investment Working Group, which is the government work stream that deals with trade and investment issues. And they were very receptive to our recommendations. And in fact, we were particularly pleased that there was such high alignment on the issues that we had raised. They are concerned about trade and stability in trade. They are concerned about sustainability and especially climate change. They are also concerned, in fact, I think they are working on a presidential project for African inclusion into the global economy.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it there. Busi Mabuza, thank you so much for your time this evening and all the best. Busi Mabuza is the chairperson of the B20 Trade and Investment Task Force, forming part of the B20 leading into the G20. We're going to take a short break. On the other side of this, we continue with Face the Nation. And welcome back. Tourism Minister Patricia de Lille threw down the gauntlet at her detractors for accusing her of protecting corruption in South African tourism, calling on them to provide the evidence to the hawks. In her opening remarks to the Tourism Portfolio Committee, she stated her case as she faced questions on her conduct in dissolving the Tourism Board. She was asked to give an update on circumstances surrounding the suspension of the CEO and explain issues around the forensics investigation report that probed a 4.1 million rand contract, amongst others. Joining us now for more on this is the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Tourism, Ronalda Nalumango. Ronald, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Whilst the committee satisfied with the minister's explanation, not just of fact and chronology, but guiding principle on why she chose to dissolve the tourism board?
Good evening, Mr. Mnyatela, and good evening to the listeners. The committee of Portfolio Committee on Tourism were not satisfied with the answers that we received from the minister.
Okay, why is that the case? There's a factual dispute between the minister and the erstwhile board. The minister claims a meeting happened, and this meeting happened irregularly, therefore in contravention not just of the King Code principles, but also of the Tourism Act. The board says, hold on, the meeting the minister claims happened never actually happened. The decision we made to appoint Lawson Naidu as our representative when the chairperson of the board resigned wasn't a meeting. It was email communication, and we concluded he will speak on behalf of the board. The minister is not correct on the score of this. How did the Portfolio Committee evaluate that factual dispute?
The Portfolio Committee have asked several questions to both the board and the minister, and we then ended up in our closing remarks having to seek legal advice from our legal department in terms of the back and forth between the board and the minister, because the minister is adamant that she received legal advice and she stuck to her guns in terms of the legal advice that she received. And you could see that there was a dispute coming from the board, and to avoid the back and forth between minister and the board, we've then said, we need that legal advice. And then based on the legal advice, we will then come back again, and bring everyone again to a committee meeting.
Yeah, but Ronalda, you just told me now that you don't accept the answers that were presented by the minister. You're now saying you're going to wait on the legal advice. For you to not accept it, it means that a priori the legal advice, you must have found fault with some of what the minister says. Outline to us very specifically what you don't believe the minister said from what the minister has said, or what you think was incorrect from what the minister has said.
The minister ignored some substantial issues on governance and financial mismanagement that was mentioned. And I think based on that, and the
such
questions
as,
that
sorry,
was posed.
just very specifically, such as, what are some of those substantive questions?
It was on the issue of the CEO, where you could hear that portfolio committee members were raising the matter on the CEO, who was the then CFO, then she became the CEO, and there were findings in a term as the CFO. There are also findings now of material irregularities, findings in a term as the CEO, and it is alleged that the minister is protecting the CEO.
Do you have any evidence from the board or otherwise to substantiate why you're concerned about that? Very specifically bearing in mind that the statutory power to appoint and to remove a CEO or any other executives at SA Tourism presides in the powers of the board, not the minister.
What is currently happening is that, it's the minister, according to the Act, the minister is the one who appoints the board, no one else, it's the minister. So that powers, according to the Tourism Act, lies with the minister. And so we have then said, because the minister alluded in the meeting that the dissolved board is going to litigate. And therefore, once that is happening, if the dissolved board litigates, it means that, the hands of the committee then is cut off. Then it is a sub judice matter, and we will not be able to further interrogate what has happened in
Ronalda,
terms of the SAT.
It's almost 2.5 weeks later and the board has still not filed any papers. They're still applying to their mind as to whether they will choose to litigate, right? They've not filed papers in any court just yet. Of course, that means that the committee's hands aren't cut off, at least not yet.
No, that is why we are waiting for that legal opinion. We are waiting for the legal opinion based on what the minister have said, because she also received a legal opinion on why she dissolved the board. And as you could see, because our portfolio committee meeting was streamed live, that there was a back and forth between minister and the board. And that's why we said we needed to get a legal opinion on how we need to move forward as the portfolio committee.
Notwithstanding that, is it the view of the board, of the committee rather, that the board must be reinstated?
The view of the committee, we have raised our concerns during that. There were members, it was streamed live, that felt that the board should be reinstated. But as we said that we needed to get a legal opinion in terms of the Act, the powers that the minister has and the powers that the board has, where the powers of the minister ends and where the powers of the board begins. So we needed to get a legal opinion in terms of that.
The Auditor General wrote to the minister earlier this year expressing concern around the fact that the board still has not appointed a head of internal audit and still has not appointed a permanent CFO. Of course, leaving the financial health of Tourism South Africa not only precarious, but of course undermining the integrity thereof. Which means that we can't really with certainty look at the financials and accept them for what they are as a true reflection of the financial position of Tourism South Africa. The minister repeatedly raised this with the board, and it seems as though, and the minister makes the claim that the board dragged their feet in filling those vacancies as is their statutory requirement. Did the committee at all attempt to hold the board accountable for that?
What is currently happening is that we know that it's not just those two positions that were vacant. There were other key positions as well in the board that were vacant. And those positions were not filled, but the suspension of some of those officials were done by the acting or the CEO. And you must not forget, when we are saying there was a vacancy created of a CFO, the person that is now the CEO was the CFO before. Well, and all of the findings or allegations are pointing at the person who was the CFO, who is currently the suspended CEO.
Yeah. Okay. Very specifically here, the committee has now requested for legal advice for the minister to come back and for the board to come back at a later stage. The minister has, in the interim, appointed an interim structure board to take care of governance issues. What is the position of the committee on that interim structure?
On the interim structure, I think we have requested that the work needs to proceed of the SAT, and we have requested that the minister put in place an interim structure to continue. We have the G20 that is just around the corner, and we need it to continue with the work of SAT. So the interim board they are currently proceeding with the work. What we have, however, raised in our closing remarks is that there were specifically one member that the minister have appointed, the deputy chairperson of the interim board, that we said that we needed a legal opinion on, because she also served in the previous board, and previously she has lied under oath, and therefore we said that we needed to get a legal opinion on it.
Yeah, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Ronalda Nalumango, thank you so much for your time this evening. Really do appreciate it. Ronalda is the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Tourism. Let's take you to this now. We're going to be having a conversation now with one of the former members appointed by the president to the Anti-Corruption Advisory Task Panel in 2022. The National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council wrapped up their work. The Advisory Council was put together to guide the implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy and, among other things, to advise on the strengthening of the state's anti-corruption architecture. The National Anti-Corruption Architecture Closeout Report, which will be released publicly, consists of a set of recommendations which, amongst others, include the establishment of a permanent, independent, overarching anti-corruption body, strengthening and coordinating of law enforcement agencies, and the use of artificial intelligence to prevent corruption, and the establishment of an anti-corruption data sharing framework. Speaking to us about their function over the last 3 years, we now speak to former member Barbara Schreiner. Barbara, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. When the former Chief Justice handed over the Zondo Commission of Inquiry report to the President, one of the key recommendations was exactly that, an overarching anti-corruption inquiry body that will permanently look into acts and allegations of corruption. But nothing has been done about that just yet. The President last year had published a progress report on the implementation of these recommendations, but it didn't include any real substantive work around the establishment of such a body. Do you believe the political will exists to establish an overarching permanent anti-corruption body? Hi, Barbara, I think you may have muted yourself. We can't hear you. Someone asked you to just unmute yourself and try that.
I hope you could. Can you hear me now? Yeah,
Loud
the classic mistake, sorry.
Loud and clear.
Good evening, and good evening to everybody out there, and thank you for this opportunity. I think it's a complex question. I think the political will does exist in certain quarters. Obviously, in other quarters, the political will, there's pushback. This is not a plain sailing kind of space that we are operating in here. When we presented our report to the President last week, the Deputy Minister of Justice was there. We had presented our report to the Minister of Justice prior to that. The President, the Deputy Minister, and the Minister, all very supportive of the recommendations around setting up an independent anti-corruption agency, and giving real confidence that it was going to be taken forward. But we know that these processes are tricky, and we know that there are other forces that don't want to see any strong action being taken against corruption. So I don't think that there's any time to rest on one's laurels and go, we've written a report, now that's going to translate into magic overnight. I think it's really up to those in government, but also civil society, the private sector, to keep the pressure on to make sure that this recommendation actually does translate into action.
Yeah, well, I have to ask you this self-reflective question. Since the Advisory Council was appointed, has the South African corruption crisis and pandemic gotten any better? More importantly, one of the things that the Advisory Council was meant to think and pontificate about is improving the country's corruption perception index. Has that index been improved?
We were not tasked with improving the corruption perception index. We were tasked with advising the President on the implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy and the implementation of the Zondo Commission recommendations insofar as they related to issues of systemic corruption. We were not involved in the kind of issues around particular cases and individuals being charged or anything of that nature. And so you need to understand that we were an advisory committee. We were not a committee that could actually take action. So changing the CPI is an enormous task. Personally, I have some concerns around the CPI and what it actually reflects. I think one needs to be very careful about taking that as a gold standard of measuring levels of corruption in a country. Nonetheless, the question of whether things have improved over the 3 years that we were in office, I think there have been substantial strides being made. I think if we look at some of the legislation that has gone through, I think if we look at some of the stuff that the National Treasury is doing, for example, around the digitalization of procurement, I think if we look at the recoveries that have been made in relation to corrupt money, I think there have been strides made. I think if we look at the rebuilding of structures like SARS, if we look at the rebuilding of the NPA, things like that, there has been considerable progress. I think in many ways as South Africans, we're very tough on ourselves. We don't always take the wins where we have them. Could we have done more? Probably we could have done a lot more. But I do think that there has been progress, and I think we need to celebrate the progress. Does that mean we're out of the woods? No, we have a huge amount of work to do as a society, and it's up to all of us. I mean, the National Anti-Corruption Strategy talks about a whole of society approach. This is not something that government can tackle on its own. This requires all of us, daily lives, in our workplaces, to come together and tackle this. And that's the only way that we're really going to make a difference and get this problem under control.
Yeah. The distinguishing factor between everyday run-of-the-mill corruption and state capture in particular is the systemic and deliberate attempt at weakening the institutions meant to safeguard us from, of course, the insidious practice of malfeasance and, of course, hollowing out the coffers of the state. And that means that part of the work of anti-corruption has always got to be around strengthening institutions, but also rebuilding institutions, but also making institutions foolproof against external actors from being able to attempt at doing this again. What work is the panel advising the President should be done around institutional reconfiguration and reform?
So I think we've made a number of recommendations. The key one is what you referred to, which is the establishment of the Office of Public Integrity, which is a dedicated anti-corruption agency. And we're saying that in building that agency, and that's an agency that should be focused on prevention of corruption, because global practice has shown that while the kind of law enforcement approach, charging people, etc., is critical, you can never get your way out of corruption purely by the reactive law enforcement approach. You have to deal with the preventative stuff. So very critically, we need to foreground the preventative work, and that's something that the OPI, the Office of Public Integrity, would need to take on. What we are saying is that we already have in the SIU a really good basis from which to build up into an Office of Public Integrity. You talk about creating institutions that are foolproof. There is no way that you can create an institution that is foolproof. We have seen globally where you have really, really good anti-corruption bodies that have been working for 10 years, change in government, and things can be undermined very fast. So there is no perfect foolproof way of doing that. We have suggested that the OPI should be a Chapter 9 institution because it gives it greater protection than simply a statutory body. But even then, that's not a foolproof protection mechanism. And anti-corruption agencies can be and have been captured and used in the wrong ways. So really, the only foolproof thing is a citizenry that is actually taking action and standing up and saying, no, this is enough of it. But I think so. We've made the recommendations around the Office of Public Integrity. We've also made very strong recommendations that the law enforcement agencies need to be strengthened. You talked about the hollowing out of organizations. We've seen that under state capture. We've seen massive corruption in state institutions. There really does need to be a process that addresses that. And of course, one of the things that we're delighted about is that our erstwhile chair is now the Minister of Police and can take some of these recommendations into into SABC and try and deal with them in SABC, because there's a great deal of work that needs to be done there.
Yeah, Barbara, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your work. Really has been an honor and a privilege to speak to you. Barbara Schreiner is one of the members, former members of the term that has come to an end of the anti-corruption advisory panel that meant to advise the president. Well, we want to recap your question of the day, and we're asking you the following. What is your take, rather, on the arguments raised in court yesterday between General Sibiya and General Masimula? And Bono Mnguni says to us, General Sibiya is trying to save his skin. The National Commission did the right thing by granting Shadrack Sibiya special leave pending the Madlanga inquiry. This will allow the investigations to run smoothly without any interference and tampering with evidence. Good evening, Oliver. As the employee, it is within his own right to challenge his suspension, Rabutata says. Sidwell says documents can't lie, dormant in a particular office and not be investigated. Whatever they do, they must follow that process to unfold because bereaved families want closure. Well, we continue to take some of your reactions. We're going to take a short break. On the other side of this, we speak to the MEC of Agriculture in Gauteng, Wiswa Ramakgopa. A lot of food goes to waste, particularly by grocers and supermarkets who weren't able to sell the food by the sell-by date. Well, Wiswa Ramakgopa, who's the MEC for Agriculture in Gauteng, believes that should not be the case. And she joins us now as we discuss the policy mechanisms through which that can be prevented. Mr. Good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. How much food goes to waste in Gauteng?
Good evening, Oliver. It's a massive issue. If you look at a national figure, we're talking about close to 10 million tons of food a year that goes to waste.
How many people can that feed?
Well, if you look at the statistics in terms of how many people are actually classified as moderately to chronically hungry, you're talking about 9.8 million people, right? So already, I mean, just the quantums of that relative to the amount that's going to waste is quite excessive. At a Gauteng level, you're looking at close to 2 million people who are going to bed hungry, who are classified as chronically hungry. So 10 million tons of food waste a year could effectively feed all of those people a few times over, and really that's where the source of the tragedy lies.
If I grow tomatoes in Randfontein and I take 10 tons for the day to the market and I'm only able to sell 6 tons for the day, and the other 4 tons needs to be kept in storage for a day or two maybe.
Sure.
Otherwise the storage fees the overheads will be so great that I may as well just get rid of it. I'm left with the option of going back to the market one more time, and if I can't successfully sell it, I have to discard it. Now you're saying that those 4 tons of tomatoes should not be discarded, that they should in fact go to the homes of people who are hungry.
Absolutely.
How do you administer that?
Absolutely. So, and you've spoken about but one element of it. So there are a number of points actually in the value chain where there is wastage. Part of it, as you say, is in years, for example, where there's overproduction and you've got excess supply and therefore the prices are very low. So it may not even be worthwhile for a farmer to go all the way to the market because it's more expensive actually to sell the product than what they're going to get out of it. And so some people will end up composting that food, but others indeed will just throw it out and waste it. Now, what we need to be able to do is solve the problem of how we make food more accessible for people. In other words, getting it from where it is to where it needs to be, and looking at how we close the logistics gap there. And you've got a number of organizations already doing that work, but it's not at the scale at which it can be. So you need to be able to work with retailers, with farmers themselves, to be able to move product reliably from farm gate to table in the shortest amount of time possible. And what you'll also find, especially in a Gauteng context, is that the problem actually, the hunger problem, is most acutely experienced in urban areas. So in these types of scenarios, it's not that the distances are even that far, but it's just that nobody has really taken it upon themselves to do that and to make sure that where the food is being grown or where it's being retailed or where it's being wasted, it's able to be picked up, collected and taken to communities that are actually in need and vulnerable.
Now, here's where the crisis comes in, right? Let's go back to my tomato farm in Randfontein. I don't actually own one, just for the record. It's hypothetical. But let's go back to that. If the community is who I service, that is to say, largely the greater Randfontein or Western area buys my tomatoes.
Yeah.
And if they realize, hold on, if we just don't buy the tomatoes, it's going to have to give it away for free in any case.
Right.
So let's just wait it out until he gives it away for free, and then I have free tomatoes instead of having to buy it. And that is the crisis of capitalism, is that it's always profit-seeking, and where there isn't a profit incentive, there isn't an incentive to continue to do business. How does your thinking address that?
Well, I mean, fortunately, we have international best practice and test cases where food waste legislation has been enacted and has actually been very successful and has not collapsed the capitalist economy or the food economy. For example, in France, you have what is known as the Garot law, which was enacted in 2016 and has been very successful in reducing the amount of food waste by 50% in France alone, and is now actually being rolled out in many other different countries in the EU. So it really is about indeed understanding the unique circumstances of that particular environment, but ultimately it's about transferring the responsibility of solutioning to the actual producer themselves.
But is that an analogous comparison? Very specifically, if you look at the comparative, you'd have to look at OECD countries that have the levels of poverty or comparable levels of poverty to South Africa. France doesn't, right? We have just about half the country going to bed hungry in real terms.
Sure, but hunger is hunger. Whether you're hungry in France or you're hungry in South Africa, it's still the same. And it's still a complete, it goes against what we stand for, it goes against what our constitution enshrines and says people are entitled to. So we have to be able to indeed come up with solutions that are suitable for our particular context. But as I'm saying, we have test cases and we are not working off of a complete blank slate. We need to be able to look at what has worked globally and then be able to apply it locally. And like I'm saying, I think there are a number of different elements that one must look at. So of course you must look at how you move food from point A to B. And if you look at organizations that are currently doing that, they are working with not just growers of food, but also agro-processing companies, your big brands like your Tiger brands and other things. Because the other issue on that side is that you have like best before dates and sell by dates. Now, a best before date does not mean that the food rots on that date.
Sure.
But what it means is that it is they are legally not permitted to sell it after that date. But the food is perfectly good. And it's perfectly edible. However, at this point in time, the retailers do not have any incentive to actually donate that food and get it to where it needs to be. And a law or a legislative instrument would at least be able to create the necessary protection even for retailers who want to donate food and enable them to do that and take that upon themselves.
Yeah. How do you action this? How do you begin to get the buy-in for it and not have growers and retailers feel like, you've now placed the burden of addressing poverty on us when you, the government, should be using your instruments and resources to address poverty and hunger?
Well, fortunately, we've already started actually consulting with a number of different stakeholders in the food industry. So civil society organizations, as I've said, as well as with the agricultural sector themselves. We are currently actually in the process as one of the big commodity organizations who approached us as a government department, provincial government of agriculture, saying that they had excess production that this particular season and would like to donate to the school feeding program, the school nutrition program. So what it requires of us is to build now the systems that enable that to be possible. And that's what we have to take upon ourselves. So I'm not anticipating that it's going to incur massive pushback. I think it's a problem that many stakeholders in the industry want to see resolved. Nobody wants to throw food away, but at the same time, nobody wants to incur to work at a loss simply because there are social problems that need to be solved. So we need to, as government, also be able to meet industry in the middle and create and facilitate this process so that it's not going to tank, obviously, the industry, but it will help us collectively solve the problems that I think we all want to solve.
Yeah. How far out is this from becoming a reality?
Well, look, we have to be able to build whilst we're in flight. So whilst we work on the legislation, which is already, the baseline research work is already underway, but legislation takes time. So in the meantime, as I'm saying, the work of engaging with industry and starting to build out some of these programs has to start happening. Before you come with the stick, I think there are many ways to incentivize people to get involved in these types of initiatives, and we've already started. We have, as I'm saying, partnerships with industry bodies, commodity organizations, and we recently have also engaged with Department of Education to see how we can work closer with them to actually get food to children, because that's really the core area that we want to address, is childhood hunger. In the age of 0 to 6, that's the ECD learning age, and help to close those gaps. So we've already started that work at a programmatic level, but we're hoping that over the next year or two, we'll be able to get the actual legislation itself, at least in Parliament and out for public input.
Yeah. Well, also, shout out to organizations like Feed the Nation, who have, for more than 10 years, been doing this sort of work, trying to put an end to food waste. Missy, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for coming in. Really do appreciate it. And I will say, I think it's a really progressive piece of legislation and idea. I think no one deserves to go to bed hungry, and I think this is important work. And so I do hope that we, at least in our lifetime, put an end to food waste while people still go to bed hungry. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Really do appreciate it. Well, let's have a listen at some of your WhatsApp voice notes that has come through this evening on our question. What is your take on the arguments raised in court between General Sibiya as well as General Masimula yesterday? Let's have a listen at this.
Good evening, Dixon. Staviso from Jacobsdal Ritchie. The General Masimula acted within his rights, and we as South Africans must support the National Commission because a lot is happening there. Clearly, there is dockets that is missing. There is dockets that must be investigated. So up until the commission sits, can everyone just await the commission to commence, and then we will wait the outcome out of the commission. So let us support the National Commissioner. Thank you.
It's good that Fani Masimula put Sibiya on suspension. Sibiya took a directive from the minister, which the minister is not for operational purposes. It's only for oversight. So Sibiya actually jumped the gun. So he should be on suspension. My name is Murawadi Maisela from Soweto.
Well, that brings us to the end of the program tonight. Thank you so much for your time, your engagements. I really do appreciate it. For myself, Oliver Dixon, and the team, it's good night for now. Cheers.